The 1970s saw the beginning of nuclear-free New Zealand. Flotillas of brave small boats sailing out to protest the arrival of nuclear-armed warships. Visits by the USS Truxtun and USS Long Beach, American and French weapons in the Pacific were all met by non-proliferation pickets on plucky little sailboats. In 1973, the ship Free sailed 5,000 kilometres from Whangarei to French Mururoa to protest atomic testing in the Pacific. A peace squadron made out of private boats sailed into harm's way and the French bomb tests. It's a bit of Kiwi national identity. One of those moments we like to point to when our little nation stood up to the big guys and charted our own course. But there's one atomic secret that went under the radar. Even as the Peace Squad were being boarded by French Marines, there was nuclear cargo sailing through New Zealand waters unchecked. The boat they should have been focusing on were far less conspicuous. American freighters carrying topsoil from Antarctica, contaminated with radioactivity. Between 1972 and 79, the US resupply mission, Operation Deep Freeze, was moving 9 million litres of radioactive topsoil to be disposed of between the Ross Sea, Littleton, and Port Hueneme, California. But where did all this waste come from? Little did Greenpeace know, hidden away in the ice at the Ross Dependency was an experiment in radioactivity that could challenge a dream of nuclear-free Aotearoa. This is the story of PM3A. Affectionately named Nukey Poo, New Zealand's dirty nuclear secret. Antarctica is the last place on Earth to be reached by humans. So how is it so difficult to say who got there first? And why does everyone want a slice of what seems to be the world's most inhospitable continent? My name is Thomas Bywater. In March 2020, while stranded on a ship in the Drake Passage, I had the opportunity to meet some of the adventurous characters drawn to Antarctica and learn some of its surprising episodes. Stories of archaeological hoaxes, murders in a continent without police, and a research station baby boom. In the span of just 200 years, the 7 countries with claims and permanent footholds at the bottom of the world have developed rich, sometimes contradictory histories, New Zealand amongst them. This podcast aims to explore some of these episodes and see if Antarctica's short history could go back further than first thought. This is Detour Antarctica. Scott Base is often romanticised as a rugged last outpost of New Zealand, 30 degrees south of Bluff. You'll find old editions of NZ Geographic, the odd bar of Whitaker's, and even AA road signs to the landing strip. It's a bit of home, 4,000 kilometres away from home. Surrounded by pack ice and seals, it's depicted as the loneliest place on Earth. But many fail to mention quite how close their neighbours are. McMurdo Station is close enough to drop in for a cup of coffee.
There's not a lot to do in Antarctica after hours, so one way to break boredom and monotony was to go over to the American base. We were allowed they had several bars over there. You could go over there and you could drink coffee if you wanted, that sort of thing. The Americans were invited over to us because we had the only telephone system in those days. If we had problems with our gear and we couldn't fix it, they'd give us a hand and vice versa. So we shared a lot of camaraderie, I guess, in those days.
Both at the same end of Ross Island, the US base is around 12 times larger than Scott Base. It's hard to ignore. Scott Base's own Tatty Flag Bar has always had a healthy number of US visitors too. There's a brother-little brother dynamic. Apart from the runway, a couple of bars and the social opportunities, there's a lot the two bases share. But that might not always be a positive thing. When Peter Breen first arrived in Antarctica, the first thing he noticed was bulldozers and heavy equipment.
I was selected as the assistant base mechanic at Scott Base and went down for the summer, 81-82 summer. It was after we arrived on the ice runway that we were picked up and taken to Scott Base by vehicle through McMurdo. And there were some bulldozers working on Observation Hill, and one of the guys asked, "Oh, what are they doing?" It was quite a casual comment saying, "Oh, they're still removing the radioactive rocks." One of the guys said, "What from?" They said, "These with our nuclear power plant."
What Peter had seen was the lingering scars of one of the biggest mistakes made on the continent. One which is little discussed.
On July 13, 1962, PM-3A began delivering full power to McMurdo Station. It brings warmth to laboratories and quarters. In winters to come, PM-3A will bring light for the long night. The plant will continue to deliver its 1,500 kilowatts for decades. It will operate on a single fuel core for 2 years of full power operation. PM-3A is the first nuclear power plant in the Antarctic. This peaceful use of atomic energy has shown the way for many others that will spread civilization in the world's remote areas. Antarctica will never be the same.
PM-3A was supposed to be the glowing heart of the frozen South. A 1,500 kilowatt nuclear reactor providing theoretically unlimited energy on site, it was supposed to future-proof McMurdo Base. It would reduce the reliance on oil and fossil fuels and bring Antarctica into the atomic age. Driving steam-powered turbines to produce electricity, it also produced meltwater, converting ice into 14,000 gallons of drinking water a day. It was the start of a clean Antarctic future. That was the theory. Those who had to work with her knew her by a different name, Nukey Poo. Like all the service vernacularisms, it's colourful, descriptive, and cuts to the heart of what people thought of it. But Nukey Poo?
I think it was an Americanism that named it because it just started leaking so much.
But before we get to that, we have to first answer how a portable nuclear reactor came to Ross Island, in the New Zealand dependency, on what is effectively New Zealand soil. In the 50s, opinion on nuclear power was extremely polarised. Nuclear weapons were the force that characterised the Cold War. But there was an effort to rehabilitate the technology in Atoms for Peace. Eisenhower's speech highlighted the mixed feelings towards the nuclear age. So, the same president that oversaw the Antarctic Treaty also had a soft spot for uranium-fueled turbines. Now, you may recall Antarctica is supposed to be a nuclear-free zone. It's the founding article of the Antarctic Treaty. No nukes, no nuclear waste. But Nukey Poo was switched on in 1962, arriving on the continent during the grey period of the treaty coming into effect. The treaty strictly prohibited nuclear explosions in Antarctica and disposal of nuclear waste material. But power plants were conspicuously not on the list of atomic contraband. Where better than a place devoted to scientific endeavour and peace for a reactor? This was Antarctica as the antidote for the Cold War. US Admiral George Dufek claimed it a dramatic new era in man's conquest of the remotest continent. And he had big dreams for that continent. By the year 2000, Dufek predicted greenhouses fueled by atomic energy, and to make the continent habitable for all sorts of human activity. Nuclear bombs, bad. Nuclear power, good, to oversimplify the view. There was an optimism for seemingly limitless energy. Any downsides were yet invisible. So, Navy Nuclear Power Unit, PM-3A, was born. Also the origin of Nuke, PU, Nukey Poo. One of those military acronyms with a dark sense of irony.
And that's what I was saying before with the 538 leaks. It actually leaked more than it produced power.
Like all panaceas, Nukey Poo was a victim of its own hype. It was plagued by problems from day one, and it never lived up to the promise of unlimited low-cost power. 30% of the time it was out of action. It was deemed that running diesel generators would be cheaper, more reliable, and wouldn't require a degree in nuclear physics to run. It clocked up almost 500 operating errors. Then, in 1972, the most significant of these occurred. Having been shut down for maintenance, it was discovered that hairline cracks were forming on the visible ducts. The extreme environment and chloride stress corrosion had weakened the metal, making it prone to sudden failure. Those inspecting the reactor said it might be possible parts of the machine were already compromised. They never switched it back on. Just 10 years into its 20-year operational life, it was decommissioned. R.I.P. Nukey Poo. However, the complications were more deeply rooted and would stick around long after the reactor was switched off.
And it leaked radiation into the groundwater, which is underneath the reactor building. So, it could have gone anywhere, this stuff. It's like the flu. You can't see it, but boy, you sure know when you got it.
The tiny portable reactor was designed to be a clean, lightweight power solution. The clean-up was anything but. Small enough to be shipped to the continent in a single container, when it was recalled, they had to move half the hill it was built upon. Leaking coolant was found to have contaminated the surrounding ground and earth shielding. 350 tonnes of gravel contaminated by radioactivity and an estimated 9,000 cubic metres of soil had to be removed and shipped out of the continent. Remember the no nuclear waste rule? Yep, that's the kicker. Surveys measured up to 40 picocuries per gram, 5 times the naturally occurring radiation, 4 times the safe level for growing crops. Not that anyone would be using the land to farm. But there was a whole lot of digging to do. The site of PM3A is still unoccupied today. Officially, this was all wrapped up in 1979, but according to Peter, there was still soil being dozed from the site when he arrived. So if that wasn't the case, what else doesn't add up about PM3A? While Nukey Poo was leaking her last, the US Navy was wondering what to do with her. Back in New Zealand, anti-nuclear sentiment was going mainstream. The Mururoa nuclear testing site was becoming a hot topic. As New Zealanders got ready to sail protest boats into the Pacific and into harm's way. The Labour government of Norman Kirk agreed to send Navy frigates to sail into the testing zone and oversee the protest. The HMNZS, Otago and Canterbury. They even sent Cabinet Minister Fraser Cullman as political weight behind the anti-testing. One of the most important of these boats was the Free, for the fact that on it was a documentary film crew. Their film was picked up by TVNZ, beamed into living rooms around the country. It was arguably the ship that steered New Zealand popular opinion on nukes in the South Pacific. Documentary maker Alistair Barry recalled the project, which later would become a symbol for plucky nuclear-free NZ.
I was a member of the crew of the Free on the protest trip to Mururoa, and I think that the only real qualification that any of us had who were members of the various crews of the protest boats was that we believed that what the French were doing was wrong. As far as the overall opposition to French nuclear testing in the Pacific is concerned, I think that the boats in the zone gave a real dramatic content to the issue. We didn't stop the tests. I don't think we even came particularly close to postponing the tests. But for a small number of people, I think we contributed a lot. There were 24 of us on the Free at various times over the 8 months that we were at sea.
Sailing with families of protesters and their children seemed pretty audacious. But as Captain David Moody said, that was the point.
We wanted Free especially to represent a cross-section of the community. Young and old, men and women, different nationalities. Nuclear weapons and fallout don't respect those distinctions.
The French Navy could hardly believe it when a floating hippie ark turned up in the South Pacific, asking them to stop the tests. Eventually boarded by a raiding party of French Marines, there was only so much non-resistance could do.
You guys, this will probably be our last communication. They're about to take over the radio. They have their own radio transmission gear aboard. We have refused the tow, and we have told them that we will offer nothing more than passive resistance to their efforts. There's a party of approximately 15 men aboard Free at the moment. I do not know the identity of the man in command. He is of unknown rank.
Towed to a nearby airbase, the film survived hidden in a barrel of oranges. France continued to bomb the Pacific atolls until 1996, but not without opposition from the growing nuclear-free movement. Protests of nuclear-powered US warships were met by flotillas of small protest ships in Auckland. In 1976, the US Truxtun attracted a protest of 80 small ships with a petition of 333,000 signatures asking for reactors to be banned from New Zealand waters, which, at the time, was about 10% of the population. By the time the final peace flotilla departed in 1995, it was part of the popular imagination. Yes, it was the one they turned into a beer advert.
Yeah, they completely misrepresented our story, but that's fine.
Dan Salmon was a young film student and documentary maker who put his hand up to follow in the path of the free.
So when the testing was announced in 95, there was a call out for New Zealand boats and sailors, and I was doing a film production course and trying to work out what to do for my end of year documentary, and it all kind of, those two questions hit at the same time, people looking for experienced sailors and people looking for, and me looking for something to do for my course. So I wound up putting my name in the hat. I had an ocean navigation ticket and blue water experience, so it was, it wasn't too hard to find berthage on a boat, and the boat that I wound up going on, I was the only one with that ticket, so they actually needed me to clear customs to leave.
The Grassroots anti-nuclear movement had been a part of his Auckland childhood. On the Waitemata harbour front, you couldn't miss it.
The only sign of protest is a group of women standing on Marsden Wharf banging pots.
I grew up through the 80s, and it was, sort of doing the anti-ship and sub-visits was a big part of most of our team lives, really, I think. A lot of schoolmates and I and brothers and family would go and do the Friday night marches up Queen Street. My dad would sail out in his small two-person boat when the ships came in with, home-painted banners and stuff. And, it was just a big part of the culture of growing up through that time.
Greenpeace ship, the Rainbow Warrior, had recently been sunk in Auckland in 1985. Unbelievably, French Marines had been found guilty of bombing the ship, posing as Swiss tourists. In an oversimplified version of events, France were the clear baddies of a nuclear-free Pacific. New Zealand's plucky civilian boats, the heroes. But things are never as simple as a 30-second ad spot might make them out.
I do feel for the braveness of those first people who went up, and they had less support. The government sent up the naval boat to, in some ways it might have been seen to keep an eye on us, but, I think it was to look after us.
By 1995, they must have been pretty used to seeing, Kiwis turn up and telling them to stop blowing things up.
French were actually pretty aggro when we were up there. There was a woman from Greenpeace in an inflatable, and the French Foreign Legion guys gaffer taped their knives to the end of boat hooks to try and slash and pop the inflatables, and wound up putting it through a Japanese Greenpeace woman's ankle. It wasn't a sort of peaceful protest you get here. And the helicopters would come over and try and, buzz the boats, flatten them out across the water, so really sort of low above the mast, until people worked out that if you raced up aloft and started waving sheets around, they'd take off, because apparently the rotors can suck
debris through
stuff up into them.
Mararoa was not the bloodless protest we had been led to believe, but they helped sway opinion back home that New Zealand could be nuclear-free. In the 20 years since the Free sailed, there had been a sea change in public opinion towards atomic energy. While it would not get voted into law until the 80s, New Zealand already fancied itself as a nuclear-free oasis in the Pacific. But this did not stop 7 reactor cores passing through Christchurch and Port Lyttelton, right under the nose of New Zealand CND. 4 irradiated reactor cores had to be decommissioned. In addition, 3 spare cores were shipped out to McMurdo Station but were never used. Along with the irradiated equipment, these had to be shipped out via the annual resupply mission, Operation Deep Freeze. Once a year, an icebreaker punches a hole through the ice pack to allow cargo ships to deliver goods and take out the trash, as they say in McMurdo. Between 1972 and 79, this included hundreds of tons of nuclear waste and irradiated soil. 7 incidents involving the shipment of radioactive waste were recorded. These include leaking radioactive waste containers, damaged waste containers, mismarked radioactive waste, and the mixing of radioactive waste with other goods, all occurring after the waste left McMurdo Station. The only reason we know about this is because, years later, McMurdo staff began falling ill. C-130 mechanic Jim Landy was one of those US servicemen. Stationed out of Christchurch in the 1970s, he met his wife Pam, a New Zealander, at the airport. As if you need any further illustration of just how closely intertwined New Zealand and US Antarctic missions were. He would fly and service the C-130 Hercules between New Zealand and the ice. Years later, he and several colleagues began reporting health issues, rare cancers, illnesses they began suspecting were linked to PM3A. In 2011, a US television station launched an investigation into the reactor, led by none other than Ron Regan. No, not that Ron Regan, but the news anchor for 5 News Cleveland.
A federal panel found that Navy veterans were in fact exposed to radiation for years. And as our report first revealed, a leaking nuclear plant is being blamed.
People from the 80s and 90s that served down there, in an alarming number, are reporting cancers themselves now.
The leaks were common knowledge among those working at the base. A report into radiation exposure of those working at McMurdo had been commissioned. It determined that radiation doses were low, and the associated probability that disease could have arisen from these doses was also low. However, that was only conducted on workers within PM3A, who had to be monitored for exposure. It had not been assessing the effect of prolonged radiation, or that the soil, dust, and even drinking water that the plant had been helping to melt had all been contaminated. Kirk Hindman, a Navy engineer and colleague, had raised concerns that radiation was registering from within the McMurdo base. Eventually, it was determined that those suffering from these ailments could pursue claims from the VA. In 2017, the US Veterans Association finally paid out compensation for cancers of the brain, liver and spine as a result of exposure to ionizing radiation. This was 5 years after Landy had died in 2012.
Because it was just such an important story and one that had just gone completely unreported. I know it all got hauled out of there, and my understanding was headed to New Zealand. You know, they had a couple of inquiries here. Now, some of these guys actually gotten claims on this. Landy's widow was one of them.
There was some fallout from the Landy's case. The illness had been found directly linked to the C-130's pilot's time in Antarctica. Following the ruling, New Zealand did issue a public health statement. In January 2018, a curious public health notice briefly appeared on the Ministry of Health's website. A similar one appeared on the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment too, titled Potential Historic Radiation Exposure at McMurdo Station. Within it was the astonishing admission it was possible that those stationed at either McMurdo or Scott bases may have been impacted by power plant operations. Those with health concerned were directed to contact the then Director for Radiation Safety for the Ministry, who has since left the position. It is no longer up. But I was able to ask the Ministry how many responses they had had to the notice, and I got an answer.
4 New Zealanders have contacted the Ministry of Health's Office of Radiation Safety since 2018. These people spent time in Antarctica and were concerned about the health effects of potential exposure to radiation at McMurdo Station. The Office of Radiation Safety was able to interpret the findings of the US report and explain how it relates to their individual concerns. The office was also able to provide support to these people by referring them to other health experts as appropriate. In order to protect the privacy of these individuals, we are unable to provide any further details.
4 New Zealanders irradiated by Nukey Poo. Just as the American service persons, Jim Landy and the rest of them had suffered ill health as the result of their time cleaning up Antarctica's worst nuclear disaster. Proving a link would be even more difficult than the 7-year battle for US servicemen. Any sort of compensation is hard to imagine for New Zealand. But that hasn't stopped Peter trying. The McMurdo study is only taking into account the dosage received by reactor workers. There was no monitoring for the general population at the base. Certainly there is little appetite for finding out how much exposure personnel from Scott Base were exposed to. But last year, there was a breakthrough. In 2020, the claim was accepted as part of the military veterans inquiry via the Waitangi Tribunal process. Since 1975, the Waitangi Tribunal has been a permanent commission by the Ministry of Justice to raise Maori claims relating to the Crown's obligations in the Treaty of Waitangi. It was set up to give voice to Maori issues and hear cases where the Crown's duties have not been upheld. Cases like Nukey Poo. Many of the veterans who served in Antarctica with Defence Force Logistics had Maori heritage. The tribunal has a special place within the Ministry of Justice and has delivered verdicts which have shaped New Zealand policy, such as the foreshore and seabed dispute. In 2016, Peter Breen and the other surviving veterans submitted their case to the treaty on the grounds that the Crown had failed to protect the Maori service persons during the long clean-up of Nukey Poo. Soon, they may finally get a verdict. In 2021, the kaupapa for Antarctic veterans was deemed eligible to be heard as part of the wider inquiry into the Crown's obligations to Maori in the armed services. The Veterans Legal Council saw it as a major milestone for their kaupapa.
It is fitting that in the centenary year of the onset of the First World War, in which Māori served the Crown on the battlefields of Europe, the first kaupapa inquiry should focus on claims concerning Māori military veterans. It is also timely that the inquiry proceed with due expedition, given the advanced age of many surviving veterans.
But having begun in 2014, the scale and scope of the inquiry has meant it has dragged on to twice the length of the Great War. Nukey Poo is one of about 100 independent cases that make up the inquiry.
Close to 100 claims are being progressed as part of the inquiry. The scope of the inquiry is wide, ranging from Māori who served as part of the colonial forces in the New Zealand Wars to the current Veteran Support Act 2014.
Claims range from famous cases, such as the injury of George Nepeta on a training course in Singapore, through to the exposure of Maori veterans to poisonous insecticides in Malaya. Although the Antarctic kaupapa is undoubtedly a standout claim among many.
I couldn't put in a claim myself because I have no Maori in me, no Maori blood. We put it in on a couple of guys I knew from Antarctica and Singapore and Lincoln, where we'd all served together. We talked to them and they put in a claim and then we supported their claim. For us, that's the two things. It's the medallic recognition and the nuclear reactor. So it's been a wait-and-see game for a number of years now for the Waitangi Tribunal. I think something coming out this year, but I don't know what it is because that is in the hands of the lawyers.
The recent public advisory and evidence supplied by Antarctic veterans have been key to the kaupapa, with recent precedents set by the cases of Jim and Pam Landy. And the duty of care to Maori vets may not have been limited to their time in McMurdo and Operation Deep Freeze. The failure to contact them once New Zealand Defence was aware that personnel may have been exposed could be seen as a failing.
The Y2571 claim itself concerns the Crown's Te Tiriti o Waitangi duties to Antarctic veterans who are disproportionately Māori. The claimants say that the Crown has failed to take a proactive approach to the issue of ongoing health risks associated with radiation exposure at McMurdo Station.
Having been made aware of the health concerns, why did the Crown not seek out the veterans directly?
The inquiry process has taken longer than originally anticipated, and some key claimants have sadly passed away since the inquiry commenced. Those claimants who do remain are hopeful that hearings will recommence in 2022.
After some glacially slow progress, 60 years after Nukey Poo was finally switched off, there may finally be a verdict. But Peter still sees it as an important route to go down, to have the questions raised.
I'd like some really honest answers. That's all I'd like to get out of it. Come back with all the reasons as why they can't do this or can do that or whatever. This total stonewalling and silence, and it does nothing. It just ticks everybody off. And all the guys that I talk to, they all go, oh, bloody defence, They just don't reply. We have this thing in New Zealand that somebody wants to get rid of you because you're a nuisance. They just stonewall you.
What started as a project by Peter to get medallic recognition for Antarctic veterans has been taken in some surprising directions. His inspiration was the service medals given to Navy sailors who'd accompanied the peace squadrons to Mururoa. The Special Service Medal Nuclear Testing was awarded retrospectively to New Zealanders who sailed to French bomb sites in 1973 as defenders of a nuclear-free Pacific. At roughly the same time as colleagues were helping clear radioactive material from Antarctica. We can expect to have the first draft statement from the tribunal soon. It's a frustratingly slow process, which many of those affected by the reactor feel they may never see a conclusion to. As of 2021, of the three claimants, Edwin Chadwick, Apiha Papuni, and Kelly Tako, only Tako survives. But the truth will eventually be unearthed, even if it is currently buried, like so much radioactive topsoil. You have been listening to Detour Antarctica. This podcast has been written and voiced by me, Thomas Bywater. Each episode has been mixed and engineered by Tash Chittock, with special thanks to Ethan Sills, Francis Cook, Steph Holmes, Andrew Laxon, David Rowe, and Nadia Tolich. This series wouldn't have been possible without the translation of Damien Venuto, an input from the experts and scientists that call Antarctica home. Dan Salmon, Peter Breen, Ron Regan, the veterans, Edwin Chadwick, Apiha Papuni, Kelly Tako, and Emma Whiley at Bennion Law. For imagery, details, and Herald premium content on the Antarctic stories we covered, and to find more podcasts like this one, go to nzherald.co.nz or listen on iHeartRadio or wherever you get your podcasts.